Greetings, everyone. I'm Meyer Semiatiki, and on behalf of the Young Workers' Rights Hub in the Faculty of Arts at X University, downtown Toronto, welcome to this webinar. I know it will be informative and interesting. Thank you all for joining us today. Before I turn things over to our webinar moderators, we'd like to begin with a statement of acknowledgement and commitment. X University is located in the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. Toronto continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to live, work, and learn here together. We acknowledge the wrongs colonialism has done to Indigenous peoples. Just this week, even more burial sites were identified at a residential school site in Canada. We commit to walking a path of reparation and reconciliation going forward. Now on to today's webinar. Our topic, as you can see, is Know Your Rights to COVID Income and Health Protection. And we think this is actually a very timely topic to be exploring. There's some sense that COVID may be receding, may even soon be behind us, but the truth is it is still a risk at work, a risk to health, a risk to income loss. And this is the focus of our discussion today. So now let me turn things over to our webinar moderators, who are both student peer leaders with the Young Workers' Rights Hub. Naomi Wokocha is majoring in English and philosophy at X University with a minor in chemistry. Bryson Landrio is majoring in sociology. Naomi and Bryson, over to you both now to get this webinar underway.
Thank you so much, Meyer, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. So one thing that I will be saying is that at the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A portion, and it would be greatly appreciated if any and all questions that you have throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, I will be communicating them to our moderators. So feel free at any time throughout the presentation to just leave them in the chat. So Bryson?
Yes, thank you everybody for being here today. I have the honor of introducing our presenters. So we have Matt Cohen and Jasmine Graywall. They're both law students as well as caseworkers at Parkdale Community Legal Services in Toronto. So without a further ado, I will pass it off to Matt Cohen.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Bryson. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Jasmine and I are very happy to be here today to do this presentation and to participate in the Q&A at the end. Of course, you know, we're all thinking about the pandemic all the time, and it has had a huge effect on so many things, including on how we work, if we work, and some of the concerns we have while working. So we wanted to put together this presentation, a Know Your Rights presentation, with a particular focus on income support and health protection related to COVID in the workplace. Let's go to the next slide. I'll tell you about what we're going to do today, and I'll also tell you just a little bit about Parkdale, but just so you have a sense of what's coming in the webinar today. I'll start with a discussion of workplace safety generally, which applies all the time, and then we'll focus on workplace safety with more of a focus on COVID-19 specifically. About halfway through, I'll turn things over to Jasmine, who will focus on income support and benefits related to COVID-19. So one thing, before we get started that I want to flag is that this information has been changing frequently. As with so much of the information we've all been taking in this entire pandemic, some of these regulations change, some of the government programs change. And so we wanted to flag that for you, because even though we've done our best to make sure that the information is accurate and up to date, it could be the case that by the time you maybe need to make use of some of this information, that it may be superseded by new updates. So that's something to keep in mind. And I wanted to just flag one thing for you about Parkdale, who we are here. As you heard, Jasmine and I are student caseworkers at Parkdale Community Legal Services, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year as Ontario's first legal aid clinic. And so we provide free legal services to low-income individuals in the Parkdale neighborhood of downtown Toronto, and also more broadly. So Jasmine and I are in the Workers' Rights Division. We focus on the issues faced by non-unionized workers in Ontario. And not only are we engaged in client files, but also in opportunities for systemic change and advocacy. So that's some of what we're doing at Parkdale. And one of the things we like to do also is these kinds of public legal education sessions. So one thing I'm interested, if we can pull up our first poll question, we have one poll here for you. The question is, have you had workplace concerns related to working during the COVID-19 pandemic? Yes or no? We're curious to see what people's answers may be. I guess we can give a moment while you're clicking and filling it out. We've left it pretty broad because I don't want to define what a workplace concern might be. But Giselle, if you think we have some feedback from it, it might be interesting to see just what those results are. So there you go. Okay, everyone has had, it seems, workplace concerns. And it's not surprising because things have changed so quickly. The health issues have changed so quickly, and yet workers have still been told, well, I'll see you on Monday, right? So in some ways, we've still been called on as workers to keep doing our job, even though the world has been changing around us. Next slide. So we'll start with the health and safety discussion. And the most important piece of legislation here in this section is what's called the Occupational Health and Safety Act, also known as the OHSA. And so that will be a focal point of this first part. Next slide, please. So under this OHSA, there are three basic rights for workers in Ontario, and they are as follows. First is the right to know. You have a right to know about safety conditions in the workplace, things that might affect you. For example, do you work with hazardous materials? Maybe, maybe not, but you as a worker have a legal right to know. You also have the right to participate. And so workplaces are required to have health and safety committees or safety representatives. And that's a way that workers can participate in the discussion around safety issues and can sometimes help to change the employer's response to health and safety issues. And third is a really crucial right. And this is a right that can save lives. And so I do want to take time to speak about it. And that is the right to refuse unsafe work. You as a worker have the right to refuse work that you believe is unsafe. So it's not work that absolutely 100% was found after the fact to be unsafe, but it's work that you believe is unsafe when you're asked to do it. But there is a specific procedure you need to follow, because normally when an employer says, I want you to do this, and you say no, that might be a reason for them to terminate the employment, but not in the case of refusing unsafe work. And you'll see from the slide, there are some caveats here. Firefighters don't have the same kind of right to refuse unsafe work that most workers do. You could imagine if a firefighter said, ooh, that building's on fire, I don't think I want to go, then not particularly useful as a job. So there are some caveats, but next slide. So here's the process for refusing unsafe work or work that you believe is unsafe. So at stage 1, first you have to report the issue to your employer. You can't just think it's unsafe and go home. You have to tell the employer that, no, I believe that is unsafe. The employer is then required to investigate the safety concern in front of you or in front of a health and safety representative. And while that investigation goes on, which, could be 5 minutes, could be 3 hours, you need to be paid for that time. And if the investigation is concluded and the issue is resolved and everyone's happy, or it was a little misunderstanding and you all shake hands and the worker can go back to work. But after that investigation, if you're not satisfied, if you still believe the workplace is unsafe, then you can still continue to refuse to work. And at that point, someone, either you or the employer, has to notify the Ministry of Labor. And the Ministry of Labor sends an inspector pretty quickly to do an inspection. And they come to a decision, and they can order certain changes to be made in the workplace if that's necessary. Next slide. So these are some newspaper clips from early in the pandemic. And the point here is that there were some challenges early on with workers concerned about their employer's response to COVID-19, and we're saying, "Ooh, this is an unsafe workplace. We are refusing to work." But as you can see, a lot of those complaints were found to be unfounded by the Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor didn't agree. And so there are some specific issues surrounding COVID, which we'll get to right now in the next slide. So you cannot refuse to work simply because COVID-19 is happening around you, like in the abstract. You would need to be able to point to something in the workplace that is specific, like a specific condition of the workplace that is increasing exposure to COVID-19. Something like that could be, no one at the workplace wears masks, or workers are shoulder to shoulder, not distancing from each other, coughing on each other all day. Something like that is certainly of concern. But it's been challenging to have these work refusals signed off by the Ministry of Labor. And you'll see in the first half of 2020 that almost 300 COVID-related work refusals took place, but only one of them met the Ministry of Labor's criteria for the work refusal. And let's go to the next slide. Now, I'd like to talk about personal protective equipment. It's something that's very much top of mind for many workers. For a long time, we used to think of personal protective equipment as those things on the guy in orange on the right side. Things like the hard hat, safety goggles, maybe steel toe boots, hearing protection, those kinds of things. But in the context of COVID, our focus has often been more on the items at the bottom left of the screen. So masks, maybe even a gown, face visors or shields, those kinds of things. So the reason that personal protective equipment is important is not only because it has the ability to protect you personally, which is good, but the absence of personal protective equipment can also be a reason potentially to refuse work that you believe is unsafe. And something I want to mention here from the OHSA, again, speaking to what the employer is required to do by law. And this is in section 25 for the nerds at home following along. So section 25 of the OHSA, employers are required to take all reasonable precautions to protect health and safety of workers and to ensure that equipment, materials, and protective equipment are maintained in good condition. And employers also have to provide information about it and training and supervision. So there are a lot of these obligations on employers. It just shows how significant health and safety issues are in the workplace. So it's something that you can also be serious about. Next slide. Now you might think, well, if I refuse to do work that I think is unsafe, what's going to happen? Is my boss going to be upset with me? What comes next? So there is a crucial part of the OHSA with respect to anti-reprisal protection. And what that means is if you make use of your rights under that law, your boss is not allowed to fire you, not allowed to penalize you. So firing, of course, we know what that looks like, but penalizing could also be, oh, maybe you're not scheduled for shifts anymore, or you're not scheduled for as many shifts. And again, the list of things that they're not allowed to penalize you for is on the slide here. So if you refuse unsafe work, they cannot penalize you. If you ask your employer, hey, can you please follow the law? Can you follow these health and safety rules? They're not allowed to penalize you. If you give information to the Ministry of Labor about a health and safety concern, or if you end up testifying at a hearing with respect to health and safety issues at work, they're also not allowed to punish you for that. And if you think you've been punished or fired because you've made use of these rights, then you should try to keep a record of everything you can, emails, other correspondence. You can file a complaint with the Ontario Labour Relations Board, and there is a group at the bottom of the screen here, the Office of the Worker Advisor, who can assist in providing free and confidential advice in those cases. And the Ontario Labour Relations Board does take this very seriously, and they investigate these complaints in particular quite fast. Next slide. So I wanted to talk also just briefly about human rights and COVID-19. Human rights are, of course, a very broad area of law. And they also apply in the workplace, because work is it's so important to us as people. We spend so much time in our workplaces. Workplaces can be a source or a site of discrimination, unfortunately. So, and some of you may have even experienced harassment or discrimination in a prior workplace. It's not uncommon, and it does overlap with some issues surrounding COVID. So I thought it might be useful to talk about those. Next slide. This one, there's a short answer to this question. Can I be fired because I have COVID? No. But there's a little longer answer, which we can also talk about. Your employer cannot fire you, cannot discipline you if you're sick with COVID, or you're unable to work because of COVID, or you have been ordered to quarantine at home due to COVID. So, keep that in mind. We're human. Humans get sick. And that's something that the Ontario Human Rights Code does understand. Next slide. So the duty to accommodate and COVID-19. I'll talk about what this means. A duty to accommodate in the first place. Accommodations really relate to modifications in a workplace that the employer can provide. So, for example, I'll give one example. Let's say I break my right hand and I'm suddenly unable to input data as quickly as I used to, and I'm a data entry person working somewhere. The employer can't simply just say, oh, look at this, you broke your right hand, you can't type as fast, I'm firing you. They can do any number of things to modify the work that I'm asked to do. They could say, okay, if you type only with your left hand, can you still type? It'll be slower, but that's fine. So that's like one option. Another option might be voice to text recognition. So I can maybe speak into a microphone and it will type from there. So when we talk about accommodations, all we're talking about is the employer changing or modifying the way that work is done or how the workplace is set up in order to assist workers in carrying out their tasks. So employers have a duty to accommodate in relation to COVID-19. And the reason for this is that the Ontario Human Rights Code has a number of grounds that are listed as being reasons that employers can't discriminate against you and reasons that employers have to accommodate your needs in the workplace. So one of those, and one of the ones we see most commonly at Parkdale, is what's called the ground of disability. And it's disability understood quite broadly. And so the Ontario Human Rights Commission understands disability as referring to a number of things, including issues related to COVID-19. So how might this look? You know, you have the example at the bottom of this slide that employers should be mindful of and sensitive to workers who may be immunocompromised, so at a higher risk of COVID. Someone might say, you know, I need, for health reasons, you know, under these disability grounds, I need to work from home, or I need to work from home this, you know, half of the week, or something like that. And that's an accommodation that an employer may be able to provide. Next slide. COVID-19 and family status. So family status is another protected ground under the Ontario Human Rights Code, and employers are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of family status. They can't say, oh, you know what, this job, we only hire married people, you know, that's not cool. And family status is also an area in which employers have to provide accommodation in some cases. So this interacts with COVID-19 because we've seen how COVID has made so many things uncertain. It's shut down daycares, schools close and reopen. You know, if you may have children yourselves, or you may have a younger sibling that you may be caring for. And so the employer does have a duty to accommodate you up to what's called the point of undue hardship if you are engaging in this kind of family status activity, like caring for a sick family member or caring for a child whose school or maybe daycare is closed. I'll just note that what we mean by this point of undue hardship is the law recognizes that sometimes things might be so difficult, so approaching impossibility, that it would be unfair to ask an employer to make those kinds of changes. But it's often not the case that employers reach that level of undue hardship, because employers can do all kinds of things, right? Employers can, as you see at the bottom here, accommodations can include allowing you to work from home. In some cases that works. Modifying a work schedule, or allowing employees to take leaves at certain times from work. So there are a lot of ways that accommodations can be made, and accommodations for family status are one area that is required. Next slide. We're almost there. Oh, there it is. Okay. This is like probably the #1 question we're getting right now at Parkdale from clients. They want to know, do I have to get vaccinated? What can happen to me if I don't get vaccinated? So we can go through this pretty quickly. Some employers by law are required to have vaccine rules. So hospitals, for example. Other employers may choose to have vaccine rules. Any employer could choose to have vaccine rules. And that might be, you need to get vaccinated, or it might be get vaccinated, and if you don't, you have to get a test every other day or something like that. If your employer has a vaccine requirement, you can get an exemption due to an accepted religious or health reason that would be protected by the Ontario Human Rights Code, but not by just any reason out there. If your reason is, I don't want to get the vaccine because personally I'm just not super comfortable with it, the Ontario Human Rights Code does not protect that. And so generally speaking, vaccine requirements are, again, generally permissible, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission has said as much. Next slide. This I'll go through very quickly before turning it over to Jasmine. But if you are concerned that there have been issues with respect to health and safety at work, or discrimination at work, or a lack of accommodation at work, there are things you can do to protect yourself. So keep a record of your communication with your employer, emails, text messages, whatever. ask for copies of files that are in your employee file where applicable. Keep a copy of the records that you give your employer. Like if you submit a medical note, keep one for yourself. And if you think you've experienced discrimination or other concerns, write down the information as soon as you can, and that will be helpful. So taking down the date, the time, what happened, who was there, who might be a witness. So that's that for the first half. And let's go to the next slide. And I will turn things over to Jasmine, who hopefully can forgive me for taking a little longer than anticipated, but I'm sure we're going to be just fine. And I'll turn things over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Matt. Everything is forgiven. Don't worry about that. Yeah, so we'll start moving the presentation over to talk a little bit more about some of the financial supports and benefits that are available to you. Money is a big concern, especially during the pandemic, because of things like income insecurity and job insecurity, and we don't know what's happening because things are changing so often. So just before we start, I'm hoping we can get the second poll up to ask, yeah, if you have lost income or if someone you know has lost income due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I think, yeah, like there's so much that we don't know what's going on. A lot of people don't know what the benefits and the financial supports are there for them in this pandemic, and like a lot of these benefits are changing, and more have been added as well. So we'll talk about them in turn right now. Next slide, please. So there's a wide variety of benefits that are available to you. So it depends on the circumstances and like what situation you're in. So there's benefits if you lose your job, like the Canada worker lockdown benefit. There's the EI regular benefits. If you have to care for someone, there's the Canada recovery caregiving benefit. If you or someone you know has had COVID-19, you can have 3 days of paid infectious disease emergency leave. You're entitled to up to 6 weeks of the Canada Recovery Sickness benefits, and also unpaid infectious disease emergency leave. And one thing that a lot of these benefits have in common is that they have some of the same generic requirements, as in you have to reside in Canada, you have to be present in Canada when you're asking for these benefits. You must be over the age of 15 and have a valid social insurance number. The next slide. So the Canada Worker Lockdown benefit, it's available to you if you have lost your job or if you've had a reduction of your average weekly income by 50% or more. And you apply for this benefit through the CRA website or by phone, and you can get up to $300 a week, which would be around $270 after taxes. You must, so there's two ways to be eligible for this. You must either live in a lockdown region declared by the government. You must live in a lockdown region declared by the government, or your business that you've been working for has been ordered to reduce capacity by 50% or more. Along with those requirements, if they're also looking to see if you've had the COVID-19 vaccine, or if it's not required for your work, you must not be self-isolating due to international travel. You must also have earned $5,000 in wages or net self-employment income. And this includes things like EI or CERB or other COVID benefits. They're also considered income. So this is in 2020, 2021, or in the 12 months before you apply for the benefit. Next slide, please. So EI regular benefits. So you're also eligible for employment insurance, and you would get 55% of the income that you make. So if you work 40 hours a week at minimum wage, which is $15, you would get $330. And in order to be eligible for this, you have to have worked 420 hours. These are called insurable hours, which would be 10 and a half weeks if you work 40 hours a week. And you must have made these hours, like work these hours within a qualifying period. So the qualifying period is the shorter of two different scenarios. So it's 52 weeks preceding the last time that you have applied for a benefit claim like EI, or 52 weeks before you commence the claim. So within the year. I think it's important to note that the 420 insurable hours, this is only, this is the requirement only until September 24, 2022 because of the pandemic. After that, it's probably going to go back to the normal requirement, which is dependent on your local unemployment rate. You do not qualify for regular benefits if you do not have enough insurable hours, if you lost your employment due to your misconduct. And misconduct is something like you purposely did something that is against your job duties, or if you quit your employment without just cause, or if you are not ready, willing, and capable of working. Next slide. So the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit. So you're eligible for this benefit if you have to care for someone, and you can get up to $500 a week, which is $450 after tax. So this benefit gives income support to employed or self-employed individuals who are unable to work because they must provide care for a child who is under 12 years of age or a family member who needs supervised care. And this is, again, like each 1 week period, you apply for the period that you're looking for income support. If your situation continues, you apply again, and each household can apply for this for up to a total of 44 weeks within the time period of September 27, 2020 to May 7th, 2022. So there's a variety of different reasons why you can apply for this benefit, and that includes the person you're caring for, their school, daycare program, day program, or their care facility is closed or unavailable to them because of COVID-19. Their regular care services are unavailable due to COVID-19, or if the person who you're caring for or is under your care is sick with COVID, they have symptoms of COVID, if they're at risk of serious health complications if they get COVID-19, or if they're self-isolating due to COVID. In order to be eligible for this benefit, you cannot apply for other COVID benefits during the relevant period. Again, you have to earn $5,000 in 2019, 2020, 2021, or in 12 months before the date you apply, and not including any other benefits that you apply for during the time. Also, if you must be the only person in your household applying for the benefit. So if you or someone else is caring for a person under your care, only one person in the household can apply for the benefit for the relevant week. And you cannot be receiving paid leave from your employer for the same time period that you're applying for this benefit. Next slide, please. So what if you or someone in your household has COVID? So you do have options there. You do get, provincially, you get up to 3 days of paid sick leave, which is not the best. I recognize that. And it took a lot of lobbying and organizing to even get 3 days of paid sick leave. And there's a lot of organizing happening right now from various groups trying to get more paid sick leave for workers. You can also get up to 6 weeks of Canada Recovery Sickness Benefits, which is a federal benefit available to you. Next slide, please. So 3 days paid infectious disease emergency leave. This was provided by the Ontario government on April 29th, 2021. And it requires employers to give employees up to 3 days of paid leave because of reasons related to COVID. And so this emergency leave is available for certain reasons relating to COVID. For example, if you're going to get a COVID test, if you're staying at home awaiting the results of a COVID test, if you're sick with COVID-19, if you're getting, even if you're getting medical treatment for mental health reasons related to COVID-19, if you're going to get vaccinated, or if you're experiencing a side effect from the vaccine. You are also eligible for this if you've been advised to self-isolate by your employer or by your doctor or another authority. If you're providing care or support to certain relatives for COVID reasons. Employers, generally, they're required to pay employees the wages that they would have earned had they not taken the leave. Next slide. Okay, so the next one. Thank you. So Canada Recovery Sickness Benefits, you can get up to 6 weeks of this federal benefit, up to $500 a week, which is $450 after tax. And it gives income support to employed or self-employed individuals who are unable to work because they're sick or they need to self-isolate due to COVID, or if you have an underlying health condition or if you're immunocompromised and it puts you at greater risk for getting COVID-19. And again, this is for like 1 week periods. And if your situation continues, you need to apply. And the time period is the same as other benefits from September 27th, 2020 to May 7th, 2022. You're eligible for this if you're unable to work at least 50% of your scheduled work week because you're self-isolating, because you're sick with COVID, or you're advised to self-isolate, or you have an underlying health condition. You must also earn $5,000 in the previous year. And you cannot be receiving paid leave from your employer for the same period that you're asking for the Canada Recovery Sickness benefits. Next slide. So job protected unpaid infectious disease emergency leave. This one is, I think, very important to know just because it's unpaid, which is not helpful because the cost of living is so high, and obviously like we have bills to pay. But I think the most important aspect of this is that it is job protected. So your employer cannot threaten, fire, or penalize you for taking this leave. And you have the right to take this job protected unpaid infectious disease emergency leave if you're not performing the duties of your job because of reasons related to COVID-19. So that's like if you're under medical investigation, if you have COVID, or if you have mental health issues resulting from COVID-19, if you had the vaccine or you have a side effect from the vaccine, if you're in quarantine or isolation, voluntary or involuntary. So it's if your employer tells you you must quarantine or isolate, or if, let's say your employer says, come into work, but you say, no, I was in contact with somebody who contracted COVID-19 and I want to quarantine and isolate to make sure that I don't expose to anyone else. So you can voluntarily quarantine as well and take unpaid job protected infectious disease emergency leave. If you're given direction by your employer that to stay home and quarantine as well. If you're providing care or support to a family member who has COVID-19, if you're affected by travel restrictions related to COVID-19 and you can't travel back to Ontario, you can also take this leave. This one's really specific. This requirement, like this is very specific, but if you're subject to an order that relates to like the Reopening Ontario Act, but this applies to people who work in healthcare jobs. For example, if you work at a long-term care home, sometimes you're not able to work at like say a retirement home as well. And if you have to, if you can't work at one of your jobs, so then you can get unpaid infectious disease emergency leave from the employer that you're temporarily not working for. It's also important to note that there are circumstances where an employee is deemed to be on unpaid infectious disease emergency leave. This is for non-unionized employees only, and they're deemed to be on unpaid infectious disease emergency leave anytime they're not performing their duties because their employer has temporarily reduced or eliminated their hours of work for reasons related to COVID-19. So even if you're deemed to be on infectious disease emergency leave, you can still elect to take an unpaid infectious disease emergency leave. And it's important to note that there's no limit. Like it's not like you can only take this for a week. You can take this for however long you need. And an employer cannot ask for a medical certificate. They can say, can you show me your positive test? But they can't ask for a medical certificate. Next slide. So if you think you got COVID at work, you can file a claim with the Workplace Safety Insurance Board. And these claims are adjudicated on a case-by-case basis, and they're based on the merits of the case, and the decision maker in seeing if you're entitled to income support for this reason will look at all the facts and circumstances surrounding the case. Essentially, what they're looking for is if the nature of the worker's employment created a risk of contracting COVID-19 to which the public at large is not normally exposed. And if the WSIB is satisfied that the worker's COVID-19 condition has been confirmed, and if that's established that they were exposed at work, it's usually considered persuasive evidence that their employment made a significant contribution to the worker's illness. Mainly, the key issue to be determined here is whether the worker's employment duties or requirements were a significant contributing factor in the worker contracting COVID-19. Important to note that the WSIB doesn't provide coverage for workers who are symptom-free, even when they're quarantined or sent home on a precautionary basis. However, if you're quarantining and you're symptom-free, but then you in quarantine you develop symptoms or illness, you may be eligible for WSI benefits. So it's good to apply and see, and like you never know. It's a case-by-case basis, but it's always good to apply and see if you'll be eligible for those benefits as well. Also, your employer cannot discourage you from filing a claim. They cannot tell you to not report your COVID-19 positive test. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a lot of groups that have been fighting for better paid sick leave. As you can see on the slide, there's Justice for Workers, Safety and Fairness, Workers Action Center, and the Ontario Federation of Labor. And like for example, like Justice for Workers have been asking for at least 10 employer paid emergency leave days per year, an additional 14 days of paid leave if there's public health outbreaks, and trying to prevent employers from asking for doctor's notes in order for employees to access paid sick days. So they're doing really good work. There's a lot happening right now. There's been a lot happening because of the pandemic in general. So I think the more that I believe knowledge is power. So the more that you know, the better. And if this is something you're passionate about as well, please do join the fight. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep this very short. Your boss cannot ask you for a medical certificate for taking the 3 paid sick days that you get under IDELF or the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit or the caregiving benefit as well. You cannot be penalized for taking infectious disease emergency leave, and you cannot be penalized for using your rights under the ESA. So what can you do? Next slide. There's a lot that you can do in order to enforce your rights. So part of that is being prepared and protecting yourself. So keep a personal record of work and work-related concerns. I know Matt talked about this as well. It's good to have like documents or take screenshots and write down everything that's happening. And talk to other workers. If this is happening to you, chances are it's happening to other people as well. And there's power in numbers. Forming a union. There's a lot of benefits of unions like higher wages, job security, better health and safety. You can also contact the organizations that I talked about earlier, contact the Workers Action Center, the hotlines there, or just go on their website. You can contact Parkdale Community Legal Services if you need legal advice or if there's been a violation of your rights under the Employment Standards Act. You can also file an Employment Standards Act claim with the Ministry of Labor, and this has to be done within 2 years of when you experienced a violation. But yeah, if this happens to you, I encourage everybody to seek legal advice. Next slide. Thank you for listening to us. This has been great. Really appreciate being here. I know I speak on behalf of Matt and I. I hope that this was very informative and answered some questions that you might have had. And I'll pass it along to the moderator so we can get started on the Q&A portion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both of you for that very informative webinar. We do have a few questions to kick things off. I guess we'll start with a few questions from us Hub members here, Naomi and I. For me, my question was, for workers who take sick days and then are disciplined in ways which are harder to prove through documentation, what advice would you give them? So I guess some ways to be disciplined in my own experiences has been getting the same amount of shifts for a job, but the shifts that aren't going to be money shifts, like I'm not financially will put a strain on me. So what sort of advice would you give to those sort of employees and workers?
It's tough, to be honest. And Jasmine, if you want to answer, you can cut me off. It can be tough. There are so many ways where things can go wrong in the workplace, but the question of producing the evidence is kind of a tall order. And that's not the only area where it happens, right? Like another area is in the realm of discrimination. There was a time in Canadian workplaces where racism and discrimination was much more overt, much more obvious when it was happening. But that's generally not the case. It's not as overt anymore. It's much more difficult to show and to prove. But sometimes, if you don't have a paper trail, you won't have a paper trail of everything, and that's okay. But just to do the best you can. So one example might be, if you were the kind of person who happened to have kind of a record of, or at least a recollection of what your shifts were previously, then that is helpful to say, well, look at, this is what the change is. And you can explain why, these shifts are, either they're more spread out, or they're the ones where it's not whatever, it's like some dead zone between the lunch rush and dinner rush or something, so there are those ways as well, but it can be difficult to show conclusively. That's true.
Very helpful. Thank you. Documentation. Naomi?
So we have a couple other questions. Another question we had from the hub would be, for younger employees who are new to the workplace, how would you suggest navigating the workplace in these uncertain times?
For young workers, I know it's hard, especially because for people who, like, it might be their first job, or they're unsure of like what rights they have, and everything's changing so often. Definitely, like any like terms of health and safety, any precautions management should make you informed on this, and like what is required in terms of health and safety, what's being provided for you. Mentorship, just like speak to other employees that are working there as well, who have been there longer. I personally, in my jobs, have found so much support from employees, right? Sometimes it's not things that you can feel comfortable asking management, but you might want to ask the people that you work with, be like, I have this situation, what can I do? There are a lot of also online resources that are available in terms of like what to do in a COVID-19 situation. So just, I think, being informed and doing your research, but also don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're unsure, like either ask the employer or ask the manager, like, I don't think this is like, I don't think this is safe, or like Matt said before, if you're forced to do something that you think is unsafe work, you can refuse to do that. So I think for young workers, it's very, very important to be informed, know what your rights are, because there's power in knowledge.
Awesome, thank you. So these are some questions from the chat. What is your advice for young workers trying to keep up with the ongoing changing information and want to protect their workers' rights?
Jasmine, all right, why don't I take this? I mean, that's a great question. And it's true that information is changing so quickly, but there are a lot of websites that are very helpful, that provide a lot of information in a way that actually makes sense. So you don't have to dig through a billion pages of case law. I mean, I am in a legal office and there's all this paper around, but sometimes you want a simpler answer. The Ministry of Labor website is a really good resource. There is a lot of information on it about employment standards and occupational health and safety in a way that's easy to read and pretty easy to understand. So that's a really great website. And another one that I really like is called stepstojustice.ca. And it also provides a lot of really useful breakdowns of legal issues across many different areas, but they also have a specialized area in employment-related matters. So I would say those two websites are really good: stepstojustice.ca and the Ministry of Labor website, just to get a sense of what your rights are in plain language.
Thank you so much. So the next question is, what kind of legal services does Parkdale provide that young workers should know about?
Okay, I'll take this. Unless, again, Jasmine, you can jump in anytime if you want. I know we will have the same answer for this question anyway, which partially is, young workers, old workers, retired work. Well, not always retired workers, but young workers and old workers, we can be of assistance in Parkdale. One of the things that I think is most useful to a young worker in particular, and I know Jasmine and I both have done some intakes recently with relatively young clients. So often as a young worker, you can feel kind of alone in the workplace, because there's the employer doing what the employer wants to do. They're telling you where you have to be when. They're giving you all of the rules you have to follow. And sometimes you can really feel the power imbalance. And so it's useful to just be able to talk to someone, to give advice, to listen to your story and see how the law lines up with it. So we do at Parkdale in the Workers' Rights Division, we do intakes multiple times a week for anyone, not only in the Parkdale neighborhood necessarily. So people can call us, we set up intake appointments, and the issues that we work on are quite varied. So there can be human rights issues in the workplace where people have been discriminated against or terminated because, let's say, they've become injured and then they've been fired. Termination pay, vacation pay that's not properly paid. We can do all of those kinds of employment standards complaints as well. I'm about to finish the 4th one this week, and that will feel good when it's done. So we do a lot of that. We negotiate with employers and sometimes with their lawyers when there's a possibility of a financial settlement. So we do all kinds of things in the workers' rights area. And Parkdale also has 3 other divisions that can assist people in the areas of immigration, social assistance, and housing. But in those areas, they're more focused on the Parkdale community downtown. But in workers' rights, we have a broader catchment area.
Thank you. That's awesome. There's 2 questions here in the chat that are COVID related, so I'll go along with those. So one person says or asks, if you fail your health screening and thus cannot work, are you eligible for pay still, or is that always unpaid?
I'm going to assume that this person failed their health screening because they're showing symptoms. So if that's the reason, if you're showing symptoms and you failed a health screening, you're able to take paid, like you get 3 days paid leave, let's say if you're going for a COVID test. So you fail a health screening because you're showing symptoms or for whatever reason, you can take those 3 paid days saying that you're going to go get a COVID test, or you're staying home, or you're awaiting the results. Or if you failed the health screening because you're sick, and I know there's been a lack of testing available as well. So it's hard for people who are non-healthcare workers to get tests. What the government has said is that if you're sick, assume it's COVID-19. So if you're staying home because you're sick, and the government has said, assume it's COVID-19 if you're sick, because a lot of the other, like in terms of the flu, it's all gone down because there's, like in terms of sickness, it's mostly COVID, it's different variants. So because of the lack of testing, you're supposed to assume that it's COVID. You are entitled to 3 days paid sick leave because of that. So if, yeah, I would say yes.
And I think the only thing I want to add is that, those 3 paid sick days for COVID related reasons, which is like so obviously not enough, right? Like it's kind of crazy. But that's the legal minimum in Ontario. That's in the Employment Standards Act as the minimum. And anytime an employer wants to, they can exceed the minimum. And so it would also depend, on your contract of employment, because a contract of employment can go beyond the minimum. It can't go below the employment standards minimum. But, I once had a job that gave me 20 paid sick days a year, and I felt like a king, but now, yep, the minimum is 3 paid sick days in Ontario. And that's not even been like a full-time thing. That's been a temporary addition to the employment standards. So yeah, if you're sick due to COVID-19 related reasons, including having COVID symptoms, you could be eligible for those 3 days, or maybe more if your employer has more than that. But unfortunately, they are not required to have more than 3 paid sick days a year right now.
Well, thank you. That's a little unfortunate, but yeah. There's another question here related to testing as well that I'll bring up. Well, less of a question, more of a statement that you can probably add your advice to. Sometimes employers ask for PCR tests to get paid sick leave, yet non-healthcare workers have no access to them. So what would you have to say to this person?
So one thing I would add is rapid tests, if you do have access to them, they're technically, they're supposed to be like count as proof per se. So rapid test result also work, but we know that they're not very accurate and there's gonna be false negatives and all that as well. And like PCR tests are more accurate in that sense. But to get paid sick leave, again, I think like from what I said before, you're taking this test because you're showing symptoms or you've been in close contact. So you're going to stay home because you're either sick, you're showing symptoms, or you're quarantining, and yeah, so you are entitled. It's difficult because if your employer is insisting on a PCR test, I think you would just have to insist that I'm sorry, I don't have access to a test. If you have a rapid test, you can show that. If not, you're going to assume it's COVID, and your employer, again, they're required to at least give you access to 3 paid sick days.
And one thing I'll add, I mean, obviously it's crazy, right? For employers to say, you need to do this thing that we know is impossible. Like what a thing to say. What I have heard some people doing who have had access to the rapid tests is to make it seem a little more official, or for whatever reason, they may record themselves the entire time, like selfie mode. Hi, it's me. This is the date and time. I'm now going to do it. Film themselves stabbing their nose with that Q-tip thing, and then just like leaving your phone, filming the result for 15 minutes as it develops a line. It seems crazy, but if you wanted to like really do the best you could to document what was going on, that's something you could consider doing, or you could hope that your employer was more reasonable than even asking for such a thing. And the other thing I note is, I know we've come up on one, but I believe we have just a few minutes of flexibility if there are any questions left. Is that right? Okay. Well, oh, actually, I see one. Can I grab one and just answer it? That's what I'm going to do. So this is a question about noticing that some retail and restaurant workplaces are being unionized, and can unionization increase my guarantee of workplace safety and workers' rights? That's a great question. And I would say nothing can guarantee anything, but you should just join the union anyway. That's what I would say. There is a good correlation between improved working conditions and unions. And unionization in Canada generally has brought about benefits, not only for the people in that union working in those workplaces, but also for workers more broadly, because it kind of pressures other employers to either raise their wages or their working conditions. There is, often strength in numbers, and it can be sometimes it can be disconcerting to go to an employer and say, oh, hey, it's me, one sole employee. Can you please do the following? But if you have, if there's a union, which is a legally recognized organization, and is a group of people, a collective working together, it feels a lot easier for the union to go to management and say, this is what we're demanding. Now, what do you say? Do we have to file a grievance? So, it can certainly assist. I have been a union member and a union steward, and I bargained for a collective agreement, and I once worked for a union. I really like unions, and I would like you to like them as well. That's what I would say. That's just speaking as myself, not as a Parkdale representative. But yeah, I think it can only help.
Well, so we have one last question, and I'm a student interested in labor law. I heard that you're both law students. What would you recommend for me to get involved in labor law?
To get involved in labor law, I think organizing, and there's like a lot of organizations that you can be a part of that are advocating for workers right now. So if you're a student, if you're in your undergrad and you want to know about, if you want to learn more about labor law itself, I think joining these organizations, going to meetings, and looking at these resources is a really good way of getting involved within labor law. Yeah, I think I know, Matt, you've done like a lot of labor law stuff prior to law school, so maybe you want to speak more on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, to the person who asked the question, the fact that you came here today is already a great start. And I think, you know, participating in these kinds of educational sessions and learning through, you know, not only through the Young Workers' Rights Hub, which I understand, you know, is continuing to expand its website, and also, you know, these other groups that we've been referencing throughout this presentation, a lot of them do have opportunity for people who want to be involved in the kind of public policy advocacy side of labor and employment law issues. So that would be things like justice for workers. There was an organizing committee just this past week, which I wanted to go to, but missed because I was working on a file for a client. But some of that is really great. I can tell you that it's hard to volunteer in the labor law setting because, you know, even as law students, Jasmine and I are not legally allowed to practice law or give legal opinions. So we can only do that through the supervision of our supervisor. And it's hard to kind of volunteer for a supervisor in that way. But different opportunities might include if there are ever research assistant positions open related to labor and employment law, considering participating in those groups like Justice for Workers, going to the relevant rallies that may be hosted by Ontario Federation or whoever else. And, you know, labor law is always around us, and there is a provincial election coming up. And so there are also opportunities for people to be involved that way. And then the other thing is there are plenty of blogs out there that, what is that one called? David Dury has a blog that I'm trying to remember the name of right now. Probably Meyer knows it, but there are regularly updated blogs on labor and employment law too, so you can be involved that way. And then you can also just go in all the way, end up at a law school like Jasmine and I, and swim around way too many pages of paper and try to figure out what's going on. So that's also possible.
I would also add one thing. Good point, Matt. Even within your own workplace, a lot of times there's ways to get involved as a worker within the workplace as well, representing people like employees in the workplace. I know when I worked in a retail position, like I had the opportunity to be part of like the health and safety committee and doing all these like checklists and making sure that everything's like that health and safety is being followed and stuff too. So even within your own workplace, I think if you were to speak to management or like want to get involved in that sense as well, I think it's an option there.
Thank you so much. So that was the last question, and that concludes our Q&A portion. And whoever is supposed to take over, I think it's Meyer, you can take over.
Yes, I'll say a few words in closing, and they are words of great appreciation. And wow, this was such an informative and interesting and good session. To Matt and Jasmine, so clear, so concise, so articulate, so practical in its focus. Thank you, thank you. To Bryson and Naomi for just great stage direction and keeping things flowing. Really appreciate your efforts. And behind the scenes, maybe unseen, to Joselle Gerardo, who was at the controls for this. Thank you, thank you. And a last thing I'll add is that this Matt referenced the renovation and upgrading going onto our website. This session has been recorded and it will go up on our website, and we'll certainly promote its existence on the website. So if those of you who have joined us as participants think that friends, colleagues, family might find the information useful, probably I'm gonna say by tomorrow, hopefully, if not early in the week, this will be posted under our events subheader on our website. And just huge thank yous to everyone. This was just a fabulous, informative session. Thank you, and a great rest of the day to everyone.